Welcome, everybody. It's the Thursday edition of Talkback, the foggy edition, I guess you might say. Of course, it's my constant condition for me. But anyway, the first half hour brought to you by Bitterroot Motors, doing it right for more than 41 years. Also brought to you by the Mustard Seed Restaurant and Temperite Service, where you can call Team Blue at 728-1111. Well, here it is, Thursday. The 2015's almost over already. Just went by just like that.
Feels like we still have a long way to go.
Well, I guess it's 2014. Just flew by.
I think it's going to be a long, until my wife is done going to school. I think every year is going to feel extra long.
Okay.
So then when we hit
how much longer is it going to be?
I got 3.5 more years.
3.5 more years, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Is she going to be a doctor or a nurse doctor?
A nurse practitioner.
A nurse practitioner.
Which is kind of like a nurse doctor.
There you go. Well, good for her.
Yeah.
Way to go, Ruth.
Go faster, hon. Go faster.
Test out of some of those courses, would you? Anyway, all right. So we have special guests in the studio at 8:30 with the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio that have already been promoted in today's Missoulian.
Yeah, thanks for that, Missoulian. We'll be speaking with Mehrdad, who we've had on before, a professor here at the University of Montana, an expert on totalitarian regimes in the Middle East, and a generally knowledgeable guy on all kinds of topics.
Not only that, but I think year after year after year, he's voted by the students as either the or one of the most popular professors on campus.
I hear it's because he's a great dancer.
No, I think he's a good guy. From what I understand, good dancer. Where'd that come from?
Well, it's the University of Montana. I don't know how they rate their professors there, but I assume that dancing's got to be a factor.
In all my conversations with Peggy Kaur and with President Engstrom, I have never heard that whole dancing thing.
Oh, okay. Well, I can tell you, he's a very interesting guy to talk to. Yeah. He's fun, he's amiable, and he'll take any question and give you an answer. But before we get there, we have some open phones time.
Yes,
and
we do.
I have been outraged over some of the stuff that went on. Obviously, horrible, detestable act in France yesterday morning. We got to talk about it briefly in the morning while it was kind of ongoing.
Right.
But almost as detestable, I find an organization that we use daily, Peter, the Associated Press.
Right.
And wash with cowardice after these terrorist attacks. So maybe you don't know. You're looking at me with a little kind of cockeyed glance. But, okay, so this guy that was killed, right?
Right.
One of the lead editor at the paper in France. This isn't the first time. As these terrorists usually do, they like to strike the same place over and over again, just like World Trade Centers. You know, there's that bombing not too long before.
Because it's a symbolic place, right? Yeah.
Well, the headquarters of the editor's place were bombed not too long ago. And there's a picture of him, kind of a famous picture of him standing outside with one of his cartoons, the cartoon that supposedly triggered the bombing, right?
Right, yeah.
And the Associated Press has chosen to blur out the image of the cartoon.
You've got to be kidding me.
They even issued a statement saying that their pictures about the incident tried to not have any images of the cartoon. So you are talking about a story, trying to deliver people the news, and are refusing to, they do cartoons. You can't really just talk about it. You have to see it. That's part of the element, right?
Imagine, if you will, as Rod Serling would say, imagine, if you will, a cartoon somewhere deep in your mind. Something like that. But we're not allowed to show it because something bad might happen.
Well, the Associated Press put out a statement saying that they try not to produce images that would cause an outcry or hurt religious sensitivity. I'm paraphrasing.
Unless, of course, it's an image of Jesus in a bottle of urine.
Exactly.
And that's fine.
So a bunch of people recoiled at that and said, "Hey, you still have an image available on your photo site of the Piss Christ, this art, quote unquote, exhibit in which an artist put a crucifix in a bottle of his own urine,
or elephant dung on the Virgin Mary. I mean, I've seen them all. I mean, and they're horrendous and they're horrible.
Well, there's these other things, but this one particular, the image of this art exhibit, was on the Associated Press website. The same Associated Press that won't show a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad saying, "Laugh or we'll give you 1,000 lashes," or "We'll kill you if you don't laugh." I can't remember the French because I don't speak French, but some general paraphrasing. Anyway, so our media has kind of gone on this topic, talking about it, and there's some that have been willing to show the pictures, the images,
Right.
some that have not been able to or have not been willing to. I'd like you to play. Well, let's do it after the break because we only have a couple minutes. When we get back, I have a little clip from Lawrence O'Donnell. He talks with Ezra Klein from Vox.
Sure.
They were willing to put up all of the cartoon images on Vox.
Wow.
And so they're talking a little bit about that discussion or that decision to do that, and also about those entities that chose not to produce the cartoon images.
Okay, so we're going to we'll take a break a minute early. So when we come back from this break, we'll hear from Lawrence O'Donnell. It's called Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. So we're coming right back with that here in just a moment. This is Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. That's John King. I'm Peter Christian, and kind of the focus of what we'll be talking about today, pretty much around what happened to the terrorist violence against a magazine in Paris yesterday. And evidently, from what I understand, the terrorists are on the run, but they have leads as to where they are. But you have an interesting interview you want to share.
Yeah, so this is over here on MSNBC. The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell last night. They covered this, talking about the issue of whether or not to show the cartoon images that got Charlie Hebdoe in trouble.
Right.
Ended up in the deaths of 12 people. Anyway, go ahead and play the clip. I think it's an interesting discussion.
Here we go.
In November 2011, the Charlie Hebdo offices were firebombed the day after the magazine released one of its covers with a cartoon of Muhammad. While the bomb rubble was still smoking, Stéphane Charbonnier, who was killed in today's attack, stood in front of his blown-up offices holding up the cartoon that provoked the bombing. Most major news organizations in this country, including this network, the Associated Press and the New York Times, have decided not to show any of the cartoons that led to today's murders. The cartoons can be seen online at Vox.com, the Huffington Post, the Daily Beast, Gawker, BuzzFeed, and Bloomberg. Fred Hyatt, editorial page editor for the Washington Post, confirmed to The Last Word tonight that newspaper will publish a cartoon from Charlie Hebdo on tomorrow's editorial page. It will be the same cartoon that provoked the bombing in 2011. It depicts Muhammad with a headline saying, 100 lashes if you're not dying of laughter. Joining me now is Vox.com editor-in-chief and MSNBC political analyst Ezra Klein and former editor of The Onion, Joe Randazzo. Ezra, you decided to republish all of these cartoons today. How did you decide to do that?
You know, I'd like to tell you it was this big decision that we had a big meeting and we thought through the changes and the risks and the questions, but honestly, I spoke to my editors, I saw the post before it went up, it never occurred to any of us not to publish them. Our job is to explain news stories like this one. You can't explain this news story without showing people what this magazine did, what it published, what it wrote about. So it was such an obvious call to us that we actually, I have to be honest, didn't make a call. I actually talked to my editors before I came on to make sure I wasn't missing a link in the chain. But I do want to make one point here because I think it speaks to at least my mindset on this, which is that I don't really agree that this was about the cartoons and the way people are saying it is. I don't think this is about the cartoons anymore than a rape is about what the victim is wearing or a murder is about the street the person is walking down. Many people see these cartoons, many people do not go on mass killing sprees. And this was about the lunacy of the murderers who did it. And if they hadn't gone to the offices of this magazine, they might have blown up a bus, they might have gone on a different kind of killing spree. But I think that saying it's about the cartoons is a little bit within their frame. And these are people who wanted to kill. You saw that when they went out and shot a policeman point blank. These were killers. And I think that there was an excuse here about cartoons, but I don't believe really that was at the root of it.
Well, you know, in motive, in crime investigations, the first place the police go is they ask the people who did it why they did it. They told us very clearly today why they did it. They said they were avenging the prophet. So I get your point, Ezra. I don't see why my judgment should override what the killers actually told us. But Well, Ezra, to some extent, there's a certain amount of the mission is accomplished when most news organizations in America absolutely refuse to show these cartoons in any way. That was the objective of the murderers today.
Yeah, insofar as there is certainly a sense of intimidation, and you saw different editors tweeting about something and writing publicly about something that I think is really real, the fear of safety, right? The question of how do you balance what you think you need to do for your audience or what you think you need to do in your idealism as a member of the free press, and your fear of depriving the families of your employees of a father or mother. But nevertheless, I think that more people have seen these images today than ever would have in the absence of this act. And I think that there's been a encouraging affirmation of a free press here, and I hope internationally. Okay, there you go. 721-1290, 1-800-568-5309. So let me ask you this. If we have about 15 minutes left before Dr. Kia and Bob Seidenschwartz arrive. If you were a newspaper editor in, say, Missoula or Bozeman or Butte or whatever, would you have any compunction about putting these cartoons up? I mean, would you think twice? Would you just simply, this is a, I mean, aside from the fact that before the terrorist attacks, there were cartoons. Now, they're part of the news. They are part of the news. They're an essential part of the news cycle. So I think it would be a very responsible thing for any editor, especially dealing in print, to say, you know what, the people need to see what sparked this outrage and led to the killings of these cartoonists and journalists.
I've been following some of the comment threads about this discussion,
right.
And one of the things that I found really interesting is people say, this wasn't free speech. They're accusing the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists of being racist. By the way, I have seen many of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. They are pretty equal opportunity offenders.
Yes, they go after everybody.
They have stereotypical images of Jewish people.
Right.
They criticize Catholics. One of the most controversial images is a picture of the Pope holding a sacrament up, but instead of a sacrament, it's a condom. There's lots of other images that they've produced to, generally piss everybody off.
Right.
That's what they do. They're a satirical site.
And that is what political cartoonists have done for hundreds of years. They have basically their job is to stick their thumb in the eye of society, and in order to get people to think about things in a different way.
And one of the things that when people stand up and say, I defend free speech, and they say, I defend this, and I'm so brave, right? But for a lot of people, this image of Muhammad isn't offensive. A lot of people in the United States, at least, right? You see an image of Muhammad, that's not even, and most people in America don't even find an image of someone in their religion, be it Jesus or Mary or something, that offensive. It's just, we're numb to it in Western society. So it's not like the iconoclastic bubbles start to, rile you up there. The thing is, though, when I read some of these things, is when people started using the term racism, and it's not free speech, it's racism, as if it had been a racist speech, then it also would not have been allowed. And that's the thing. Like, how far do you let it go?
Well, let's get some calls in, and we'll get at least one in before the next break. Dave, good morning. You're on Talkback. Hi.
Yeah, about intolerance, and that's what this is all about.
Sure.
In my view, when we're all pointing intolerance at one individual group, like the Muslims right now, there's three fingers pointing back at us. And we need to also look at ourselves and intolerance in our society. And I don't disagree with anything that has been said. But, your visitor yesterday on the radio,
yes,
he struck me as very intolerant. And I think we need to look at everything that we do and say and evaluate our motives and what we're trying to do.
Yeah, but we're talking about a magnitude of difference. As offensive as our guest yesterday may have been to you, it's not like he went out and killed 12 people.
Right. No, I 100% agree with you.
As a matter of fact, I would imagine, Dave, that the people that strongly disagreed with him, he went home and prayed for them after it was done, which I think is far different than running out with a Kalashnikov and shooting a bunch of people down.
Right, but the part that bothered me the most was his defense of the Inquisition, and that was intolerance on a historically large level.
I think he was just trying to put it in historical. He
was trying to contrast it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, he didn't say he defended the Inquisition. He said that men do evil in all kinds of organizations, including the church.
This is true.
Yeah, but, and free society requires us to be free for open ideas from everyone.
I agree.
And obviously it costs people's lives.
Yep.
And I defend anyone's right to say what they want, but I sure wouldn't want your guest to be king of the United States.
Well, I don't think anybody's going to be king of the United States unless, well, never mind.
I don't think we want a king of the United States.
Hey, Dave,
unless their last name is King.
I would have to leave.
All right.
But, and that's what we have to be tolerant of all of us, and that's all I want to say.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate the call. But let's be clear. Just because you're tolerant to someone does not mean you embrace and accept and approve of what they do. Exactly. There is a big difference. And I think people need to learn semantics. Anyway, so Susan, we're going to get you on here in just a minute. We have 2 lines open at 721-1290. And then, of course, Dr. Mehrdad Kia and Bob Seidenschwartz joining us at the bottom of the hour. No extra charge for the foghorn, just... throwing it in there for you to keep you safe. So in our continuing effort to keep everybody as safe as possible, we just blast that foghorn for you until the fog disappears. But the one important thing to remember is when you get where you're going, don't forget to turn your lights off, okay? I mean, it's so annoying to come back and turn the key and go...
that would be very annoying, especially if it's bitterly cold outside and you just locked the door behind you.
Yes. All right, so here we are.
We got Susan on the line. Let's grab her.
We certainly do. I'm going to grab Susan. Good morning, Susan.
Hey, I just want to say that it's going to get much worse because we have a president that I think, and I have said for a long time, if he is not a terrorist, he's very close to it. I think from the start, Barack Obama was a plant from our enemies to destroy our country. And
you really think Barack Obama is a terrorist?
We're looking at the face of evil.
Now, Susan, hold on. Please explain. Why do you think President Obama, as much as you might disagree with his policies or perhaps the way he does things, why do you think he's a terrorist?
Because he says things that support the terrorist activities. He refuses to acknowledge, on many, many cases, that the acts of violence against our civilized world were done by individuals and not by terrorists, and they are Islamic terrorists.
Well, doesn't that, instead of being a terrorist, doesn't that make him more of a coward?
Yeah, I mean, you could call him a lot of different things. I think it's really hard to make the case that he's a terrorist. Thanks for your call, Susan.
Okay.
Great. Thanks for the call.
Speaking of the waffling on whether or not it's terrorism, by the way, we have video of this event. We have video of people saying Allahu Akbar.
Right.
This is in his name, basically. And we have a whole bunch of information from this. I wanted to play, this is Josh Earnest, who is the spokesman for the president, discussing whether or not it's violence or if it's terrorism. And he's basically called the task, why aren't you calling this terrorism? I mean, basically, this is if a Ku Klux Klan member was burning a cross on the front lawn of the White House, you could call it racism, right? An act of racist terrorism.
One would do that,
yeah. But when this is so blatant, they refuse to call it terrorism. They just call it violence.
So here we go.
The other thing that we have tried to do is to work with the leaders in the Muslim community, both here in the United States and around the world, to try to counter those violent messages. That we've seen ISIL, distort the name of a peaceful religion and distort the tenets of an otherwise peaceful religion to try to inspire people to carry out acts of violence. And that's why it's incredibly important that we see leaders in the Muslim community stand up and speak out about what the true teachings of Islam are.
Josh, when you talk
and that's
about
an important part of this too.
When you talk about countering the message, you keep using the word violence. I mean, This is an act of terrorism. That's what the president of France called it, an act of terrorism. You're referring to ISIS and other bad actors. It doesn't really matter who it is at the end of the day. You know you're fighting a very large group of people of somewhat similar concern. Do you see this as an act of terrorism, and is this something that has to be condemned on that level?
I think based on what we know right now, it does seem like that's what we're confronting here. And this is an act of violence that we certainly do condemn, if based on this investigation it turns out to be an act of terrorism, then we would condemn that in the strongest possible terms too.
Okay, there you go. More waffling. By the way, although there has been a lot of not clarity out of the White House on this issue, it does seem to me that at least one individual on the left, Howard Dean, Quranic scholar, famed, almost made it to the presidency, has been able to kind of see a little bit of light on gun laws. Go ahead and play this. By the way, after the shooting, they roamed through the streets, multiple instances where they came to clash with the police. In many instances, the police had no weapons and ran away, which would be the smart thing to do when someone has a Kalashnikov and you don't have a weapon. But why weren't the police in the city armed?
Because they have a choice. Good morning, gentlemen. Sorry, I got to jump in here.
Oh, that's a good point.
In France, in Paris, they have an option whether they wish to carry weapons or not. It's not mandatory. Mm-hmm. And in this case, they were not carrying weapons. Just a little bit of insight.
So basically, instead of a gun-free zone, it's a gun-free officer.
Well, you would have other officers that apparently have the option to carry weapons. Now, why they would or wouldn't, that's a question we probably would have to hear from the Paris police themselves.
I think this may change some of their minds. Yes. Anyway, go ahead and play this cut.
Here's Howard Dean.
Yeah, this is a chronic problem. I stopped calling these people Muslim terrorists. They're about as Muslim as I am. I mean, they have no respect for anybody else's life. That's not what the Quran says. And Europe has an enormous radical problem, and I think ISIS is a cult, not an Islamic cult. I think it's a cult. Yeah. And I think that you got to deal with these people. The interesting thing here is we talked about guns the last time, regarding the United States, regarding how guns get in the hands of the kind of people that killed the 2 police officers here 2 weeks ago. France has tremendous gun control laws, and yet these people are able to get Kalashnikovs. So, this is really complicated stuff. And I think you have to treat these people as basically mass murderers, but I do not think that we should accord them any particular religious respect, because I don't think, whatever they're claiming their motivation is, clearly is a twisted, cultish mind.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. By the way, the things that helped track down these people, surveillance on the streets, having video cameras.
Patriot Act.
People, obviously were freaked out about being watched all the time by Big Brother. Obviously, I think it's pretty clear that if the military had been armed, the police had been armed, maybe with even military-grade weapons, because these guys not only had Kalashnikovs, but apparently a rocket launcher?
Yeah.
Were driving a Citroen, which is a pretty fancy car. I mean, they were pretty souped up.
Well, they were obviously they had external support. They just didn't arrive on the scene without prior training, access to this type of equipment.
You also have to remember that ISIS owns, or should I say, stole several banks in Iraq and are sitting on $500 million in cash.
Well, as well as getting oil money from producing wells. I want to mention something that was very disturbing to me listening to Howard Dean. He says ISIS is a cult. He doesn't identify it with Islam, and I think that's a terrible mistake, to be able to say that and say it's a cult. No, they are very much a reflection of their belief and interpretation of Islam. So to say otherwise is a total misrepresentation from my perspective.
Well, I mean, I think it's up to the religious institution to decide what's a cult and what's not, right?
Well, exactly. But that aside, to not even identify them for what they are, this is part of the problem that makes me crazy. Peter, you got cancer. I'm not going to say you've got diabetes. It's you've got to call this for what it is. But we've got in the studio now Dr. Mehrdad Kia, and we are honored to have him here.
And we're going to be right back after this quick break and get him all watered up. Here we go. We're going to come right back with more of Talk Back and the Montana World Affairs Council as promoted by the Missoulian newspaper, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back. Here we are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. And it is time for the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. So we're kind of shifting gears a little bit. We have been talking about this on the periphery a little bit, but we're thrilled to have Bob Seidenshorts with us, also Dr. Mehrdad Kia, professor at the University of Montana. And I know I say this every time, Dr. Kia, but you're almost always selected by students as one of the most popular of all the professors at the University of Montana for many, many years. And so we are privileged to have you with us. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for your kind invitation. It's an honor to be here, especially with my colleague Bob Seidenshorts. And I look forward to answering as many questions as I can.
Well, we do have one gentleman on the line who says he was raised in French Morocco. So let's get to Jay. Jay, first of all, welcome to the show, and you're on.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Yeah, my parents were intelligence officers back in the 1940s and 50s, and we moved to Morocco, and we lived with the Moroccans. In those days, we sided with the Moroccans against France. Today, I oppose the militant Islamists. My mother was a scholar, not only of the Bible, but of the Koran. So when we would argue the subjects, literally by the hour. So I've got some basis here for knowing what I'm talking about. And it's very common for them to say, you are weak because you love life, and we are strong because we love death. If you can get the Koran, their holy book, from the library, but if you borrow it, you better take care of it, because if you tear it up, somebody will come after you. And they don't believe in that book the way Christians do the Bible. To them, the book is God, and they worship it. They're continually punishing each other for not being Muslim enough. There's two things every Muslim prays for. It's the two things that you need to do to be a good Muslim. One is to go on Hajj, is to go to Mecca and to touch the temple, the Kaaba. And two, and two, to die a martyr. And that means by killing somebody else. It's terrible. Now, the Hajj has gotten so much that there's not room. So now they've extended the holiday of Ramadan, which is the month of fasting. But it's interesting that Islam is the fastest growing religion on earth. It's amazing that so many people want to be slaves of God. This is what they call themselves, slaves of God.
All right, Jay. Well, hang on just a second. Dr. Kia would like to respond to some of the things you've said, so please hang on. Go ahead. Doctor, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jay, for your comments. I appreciate
thanks for the call.
Your direct and honest discussion of these issues. As you are saying, I think Islam is a religion of 1.5 billion people, and it extends from Indonesia and Philippines and Malaysia in Southeast Asia to the back streets of our cities. And we have now a very large Muslim population, and as you mentioned correctly, it's the fastest growing religion, not only in the world, but also in the United States as well. We have roughly about 7,000 mosques in the United States. And in 1.5 billion people, you have an enormous diversity of opinion and interpretations. And these interpretations can be as radical, as quote-unquote fundamentalist, as militant as the ones that we saw tragically on the streets of Paris just yesterday. And it can be also as peaceful as any other religion. We have to be very careful with this. And I have given some thought for a long time to how to approach this very, very serious challenge, not only in the religious sphere, but to our security. And I say this with all honesty, that I think for our own sake and for our own security's sake, it would be quite damaging if we turn the 1.5 billion Muslims into one monolith of one set of beliefs, one set of interpretations, one set of human beings who are all bent on destroying Western civilization. There is no doubt, as you say, that there are those radicals, and we have to deal with them with the utmost power of law and with the utmost power of force. However, there are those, as you heard probably this morning from the Imam of Paris, who actually denounced the two brothers who assassinated 12 innocent human beings as devil worshippers, and called those who had been killed in the office of the French magazine as the true martyrs. So that by itself shows to you that there is a split now. And I think the more violent the French has become, the more it has forced the more moderate-thinking Muslims to take position against them.
I was just going to say, we're up against a break, Dr. Kia, and that is exactly what I think a lot of people are finally wanting to hear, is that you said it's 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and perhaps maybe, who knows how many thousand might be in that small clique of the people who carried out that horrible. But the problem is the deafening silence that has been coming out of the Muslim world over the last 10, 15 years. I tell you what, we're going to take a break, and Bob, you'll make your comment. We also have Catherine on the line, and we have two lines open for you. Dr. Mehrdad Kia joining us here in the studio to talk about this. Talk frankly, he's already done, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have an opinion or a question, this is the time to get it answered. We'll be right back. Talkback is rolling right along. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. We're having a fascinating discussion here talking about the terrorist attack that occurred in Paris yesterday, and over a dozen people brutally massacred. And as you had said to Dr. Kia, that voices within the Muslim majority are speaking out in ways that they really haven't done that much before. So can you expand on those comments? And Bob also has an article he wants to share with us. So.
I think there are now Muslim leaders who realize that they themselves are in fact in danger of being attacked by this radical French.
Because they're not Muslim enough. Or
they are not
time,
Muslim enough, or they are not anti-West enough, anti-American enough, anti-French enough, anti-British enough, anti-German enough. And these Muslim leaders, remember, live in France, in United Kingdom, in Germany, in United States. Look, I mean, France has a population of 5 million Muslims. 10% of the French population is Muslim. And an imam who is representing doctors and journalists and nurses and writers and government officials cannot really side, even if you wanted to, with terrorists, because he represents a segment of the Muslim population which is middle class and which is peaceful in its orientation and feels that it's part of the French society. So the more radical they have become, that is the French, the more they have forced the hands of the imams. And you're completely right. The opportunistic thing was to choose silence. That is, we are not with the terrorists, but we are not with the government or with the society at large. But now I think their hands has been called. Do you want to live in France as a citizen of France and show loyalty to the French Republic and its principles? Or do you want to flirt, and I apologize for the verb, but flirt with the radicals and the French? And I think the more violent the French has become, they have forced the issue. And I think the Muslims have to now speak up and make their stand very clear about this.
Dr. Key, you made a point about if you want to live in France, are you going to be a citizen of the culture of the country? Absolutely. Or are you going to maintain your unique religious and cultural identity? Because that's been one of the problems in France, is that from my perspective, the French government has kind of waffled back and forth between making concessions and then also standing their ground, depending on the viewpoint and the political representation. That's a real challenge within France right now in terms of, are you a Frenchman? or are you just a member of our society and maintaining your own identity? And that's been very problematic, has it not?
Absolutely, Bob. And look, I mean, the French Republic is devoutly secular. And they are proud of this secularism, which is true since the French Revolution. And that goes back into 18th century. And there is a pride about this secularism. And part of this secularism is not to allow religious demonstration of religiosity to be shown in public. For example, wearing a veil, which has become very controversial. My take on this is that you can still be a Muslim in France, practice your religion freely, and this whole question of veil has been used as a convenient tool by the radicals to denounce the French government for being anti-democratic or being authoritarian or being insensitive to Muslim cultural issues. I think it's a convenient tool. But what is a piece of cloth really on the head of a woman other than an excuse to create problems and to mobilize, a certain fringe within the Muslim society against the French government? Otherwise, the Muslim community in France has its own mosques, has its own religious centers. You can still practice your religion. So I understand where some grievances against the French government is, but I do think that it is used quite often as an excuse to mobilize the French against the French government.
Well, I think the French government has special problems in Europe with this particular issue. If I'm not mistaken, they have a long history of being involved in areas where there's large Muslim populations. They have large Muslim population in their own country. And yet, in the number of large terrorist attacks, I mean, first there was, obviously U.S. was hit, Britain was hit, I was in Spain when Spain was hit. And it's been a while for France to have a large terrorist attack like this. There has been demonstrations with cars burning in the streets and things like that, and just on day after day kind of chaos, but nothing on this level before. Why do you think there seemed to be such a delay with one of these events coming to France when it seems like one of the easiest places to strike?
It's because in the last few years, France has become increasingly more involved, not only politically but militarily, in conflict zones where political Islam or militant Islam is also trying to find a place for itself. We do not hear much about this, but Mali, for example, in Africa, and several other, and we don't have time to go into each of them because there are so many, but also the French involvement and support for our efforts in Iraq and Syria, because historically France has looked at Syria and Lebanon as one of the spheres of its cultural influence. And the more the French have become involved politically and militarily in Africa and in the Middle East, they have become the number one target in the minds of the radical Islamists.
So do you think their choice to kind of stay away from the first Iraq invasion kind of bought them some time of peace?
That's what some French would argue, that the policy of staying away from Iraq, staying away from Syria was helpful, was helping France to stay more secure. And the more the French have become involved, look what now happens to us. But I think there are those in France who would argue the other way and would say we have to become more engaged in order to make sure that we have control over the radical fringe inside the French society, because now they are showing their ugly heads.
All right, we're going to come right back with more Talk Back in a moment. Dr. Mehrdad Kia, our guest, along with Bob Seidenschwartz, John King. I'm Peter Christian. Catherine, I promise right after this break, we're going to get you on. Now you've got several questions to ask, so we'll be right back after this. We're back on Talkback, 721-1290. That's John King. I'm Peter Christian. Bob Seidenschwartz, Dr. Mehrdad Kia joining us here in the studio from the University of Montana. And I promised Catherine would get her on right after the break. So, Catherine, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm scribbling out my questions here. Hopeful sign. President El-Sisi of Egypt has called for a reformation of Islam and has discussed that very thing that you were talking about before. And in fact, this Christmas season, he was present at the Coptic Christmas Mass in Cairo. I think of that was along with the Coptic Patriarch. And this is the first time that an Egyptian president has ever done that. So if he can evade being assassinated like Sadat, and if other visible leaders cowboy up and join his call for reformation, there may be an opening in some form of not appeasement, but a ceasing of hostilities. Right.
Well, allow me to ask this, Dr. Kia, and this may be terribly simplistic, but what if, as you say, there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, as opposed to maybe at the top, maybe 100,000 that are of this violent bent? Mm-hmm. Is it possible for that billion to squash the 100,000 and basically do an internal cleansing and get rid of them? I mean, or is that just, again, too simplistic?
No, it's not too simplistic, and I think you see the beginning of a very slow process. I think in some ways, I have to say, ISIS was the wake-up hour. As soon as they began to chop the heads of fellow Muslims, rape Muslim women, kill in cold blood Muslim children. I mean, look at Iraq last year, where they were so popular, and look at Iraq right now. Every Sunni tribe, and they are fellow Sunnis or Orthodox Muslims, is actually arming itself against ISIS. Saudis, who were, again, helping ISIS, indirectly at least we know, are kind of turning their backs to them. And Bob Seidenschwartz, and I wanted Bob to comment on this, showed me this fabulous article that Catherine is talking about, Revolution in Islam, which refers to President Sisi's participation in the Coptic Christian ceremony. These are, of course, ceremonial and symbolic, but it's the beginning of something that we had never seen before.
It's a start, yeah. No, Catherine, anything else real quick?
Well, yeah.
We have 1 minute, so go ahead.
Okay, I was going to ask Professor Kia. Radical Islam, like ISIS and like Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram, for that matter, calls for a universality of Islam, which is kind of in reality kind of Arabic in nature from its beginnings. And that subsumes national identity, but people sooner or later define themselves as a nation and a culture which may or may not be inimical and at least somewhat at odds with the Arabic definition of Islam.
That is a very correct assessment, Catherine.
Thanks,
and look, I think this kind of universal globalist Islam is coming head on against the real national identities on the ground. Look, the Kurds are arming themselves against this Arab-dominated movement of ISIS. The Iranians are fighting back, though for their own national interests. So you are completely right. I think the national identity element in all this is coming to haunt ISIS and other radical Islamist groups.
Yeah, well, that will be our last word for this hour. We'll continue with Dr. Kia after the top of the hour. All right, we're back. The Montana World Affairs Council on the radio continues. Peter Christian, John King, Bob Seidenschwartz, our special guest in the studio, Dr. Mehrdad Kia from the University of Montana. Before we get Misha on the phone, has been waiting very patiently through the break. We got into some things. I had to cut you off, unfortunately. So if you wanted to finish your point, please go ahead, Doctor.
I wanted Bob to comment on this article that you showed me, Bob, about Egypt, but also because you're our economic and financial analyst, you know, the kind of pool, the poverty, the unemployment, the alienation of the suburbs of Paris from which these two terrorists hailed. You know, one visits Paris and struck by how prosperous, how diverse, how open the city is. And then you go to the suburb, especially where the Arab population is concentrated, and you almost get a sense that it's a ghetto. You know, it's sort of subculture of its own, with very high unemployment, and that's usually the pool from which these radicals are recruited.
It's very important to understand the economic conditions that exist, and to draw two parallels, I think it would be correct to say it is an economic ghettoization that exists. Unemployment amongst youth, which typically in any country is always higher than adult unemployment, say is 15% in the United States, it can be as high as 40% or more in some of these French Northern Arabic areas.
Real quick, when we use the term ghetto, none of these people are being forced to live here, are they?
No, I'm just using a descriptive that describes an area of extreme poverty, lack of opportunity, and economic instability. So thank you for that,
It's
John.
a word that Americans recognize, though.
Right. Yeah. And within these areas, when you don't have these type of economic opportunities, it becomes much easier to recruit. It's much easier to get people to see the negative side, to see the, us against them type of scenario. And to give a paradox to that, Dearborn, Michigan is the largest Arabic population in the United States. Now, everybody knows Detroit's been in an economic malaise for quite some time. This area is a bright spot. This is an area of incredible economic vitality, of which Arab populations from the Middle East, principally Lebanon and several other countries, came there, worked in a lot of the factories, and then with the businesses that existed there going out of business and seeing opportunity, bought up many of these stores, started restaurants, started different shops, beautician shops. I mean, really the American dream at its base. And that's one of the things that the United States does remarkably well, is the ability to integrate people from all over the world. We've got our problems, but because of economic opportunity, the ability to move up, it creates a very different environment and perception.
All right, let's get to the phone and say good morning, Misha. First of all, thanks for your patience. Thanks for holding. You're on. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, my name is Michel.
Oh, Michel, go ahead.
That's fine. It's not really a question, but comments and to the excellent two panelists. Yes, there is two ways in Europe of bringing in the other. One is communitarianism, which is more Anglo-Saxon, and the other is integration, which is more French, and both have their success story and problems. Integration, the French mode, you have to really fuse into society. Of course, given the society is secular, right, but through culture, language, you have to fuse with society, which is a bit different in England. In England, you don't have to fuse, you just have to connect. So there's two different modes, European modes of bringing in the other. And they both have their problems, but they both don't address the postmodern crisis of identity. And what the Bob said, I think, is very important, that it's only through the contradiction of the system that those disenfranchised people going through identity crisis are going to be seduced. And there's a big problem in France, unemployment. 12 million people are unemployed. And if you go in the suburbs, which are kind of ghetto, the youth, which is from second or third generation from Arab country, ex-colony or Africa, the unemployment is 40% of the. So that's where France has not addressed, for many reasons, its own contradiction. And it's the soft belly there. And you have all these young men, mostly young men, not less young women, who are seduced by simplistic, perhaps, but very powerful discourses. And I don't know how it's going to change. It's well, anyway. So that's all what I have to say.
Okay. Well, Michel, thanks so much for your call, sir. We appreciate it.
That was an excellent comment, and I think Michel just hit the nail on the head. I think there is a pool of angry, alienated, unemployed young Arab men, and I want to remind everyone, we are not trying to find some kind of justification for the heinous crime that just took place, but to analyze where this pool of radicalized individuals come from. And usually they come from the suburbs, usually they come from these very poor areas outside of Paris. And they are usually, as Michel said, second, third generation Algerians. Many of them actually orphans. These two brothers were raised in an orphanage house. And because the father or the mother or the entire family went back to Algeria, for example. So they were raised without any family structure as well. And 40% unemployment, that's a huge number. When you even compare it with some bad economic news from France, though it's not anything as bad as the suburbs where the Arabic-speaking population or the originally North African population lives.
Obviously, there's lots of poor people all over the world, lots of orphans all over the world. Why does this keep popping up in Islamic communities? And why does it have the characteristic tone that is similar across different countries and in different cultures? I mean, people yell Allahu Akbar when they're doing these acts of terror all over the world, in different places and from different backgrounds. Not all of them poor, by the way. Many of them rich Saudis. So I'd like to if you could kind of give me what is it? A lot of people are wondering, what is it about Islam itself that seems to inculcate this tradition of terror in the last 50 years at least?
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that when we come back. And we have line one. You grab line one, John. We'll be right back. More of Talk Back. The Montana World Affairs Council on the Radio. Fascinating program continues. This is Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. The Montana World Affairs Council on the Radio, one of our special editions, and we are privileged to have Bob Seidenschwartz with us, Dr. Mehrdad Kia. And John, you just stated an interesting question before the break.
We were talking about, we spent some time talking about poverty, the area of France or of Paris where these two individuals supposedly came from, their backgrounds as orphans. And I brought up the point, frankly, it's a troubled world. We have lots of problems. There's orphans all over. There's poverty all over. And we don't have this problem all over. Frankly, this is kind of a unique, it's not totally unique, but it has a tradition in the Islamic communities that is obvious to people that pay attention to the news. And Kavi, who called up after me, was making the further point, one that I added on. There's not all the people that die in these terrorist attacks are poor. Some of them come from rich backgrounds. Osama bin Laden has a very wealthy background. And so I would like if you could I have some opinions on why this has brought up has come out of Islamic culture in the recent couple decades. I'd like to hear the professor give us a little bit of background on what he thinks. How is Islam tied to terror, if at all?
There is no doubt that one of the aspects that we have to deal with is that this is not just terrorism, it's a religious form of terrorism, right? That is, it justifies itself based on the teachings of Islam. And having studied this for the last 40 years now, I can say with some certainty, though you always have to leave a little bit of space for questioning your own conclusions, that Islam has become increasingly more politicized since 1960s. And it became more politicized as a result of the collapse and the bankruptcy and the failure of secular ideologies, especially in the Arab world. Some of your listeners remember that back in 1950s and 60s, Arab nationalism was dominant. Arab socialism was dominant. These were all European imports, right? Nasser of Egypt never prayed, never went to Mecca, and he was the most popular Arab leader. And in the battle of 1967 June War, he was completely destroyed. His army destroyed his credibility. From the ashes of the failure of these secular ideologies, a new form of Islam, this political Islam, emerged. But that's not a sufficient answer. Islam also lends itself to a certain sort of a political system. It is not just a religion. It also believes that it can create, as a religion, a political and civil society based on its own teachings. And I think that's the most dangerous part of it. That is the separation that we have in the West between religion and state, in some interpretations of Islam, is completely discarded. And it lends itself, therefore, to creation of a political system based on its own teachings, and even worse, based on its own legal code, which is the Sharia. And if we move in that direction, and there are those who are on the radical fringe are moving in that direction, which say, I'm not just a Muslim, I want to have an Islamic republic or an Islamic system based on the Sharia, then you're talking about a whole different ballgame, which is quite contradictory to our Western values, and therefore becomes a threat to our Western civilization.
So I can understand why they would be at war with culture. If you have a universal doctrine that also has an implicit governmental structure, a civil structure behind it. Now, obviously, there's Islamic people that live in the United States that are at peace with most Muslims that I've met. In fact, all of the ones I've personally met are very charitable, nice individuals, and have no qualms with them. However, it's kind of hard to get away from the scriptures indicating that government should look this way, people should follow these laws, and and conform a civil structure. But even that being said, why the technique of terror? Why picking out women and children and artists that aren't defended, that don't have a military background?
And I'd like to know,
why not military targets?
And I'd like to know where that precedent came from, because it had to start somewhere. You know, I mean, perhaps it was the hijacking of jets back in the 60s and 70s, and that this sort of thing really works. So let's use that and perhaps expand on it and create it so it's a doctrine within itself.
Yeah, absolutely, and. You know, this is a much bigger discussion, but I can say in the case of the attacks in France that the terrorists chose the softest possible target they could find. You know, the most innocent, the most vulnerable, the most unprotected and unguarded group of individuals they could attack. And they wanted to make a point that this was not just a terrorist attack. This was an attack on Western civilization. Right. They wanted to make that point. And what is more the principle of a Western civilization? That free speech, that free press. And they wanted to make a point that we hate the West and we hate the Western civilization and we hate the very principles on which the Western civilization is based. And that is free speech and free press. And the softest targets, to have an attack on a military installation would have resulted into their death. They were dealing with unarmed human beings sitting in an editorial office discussing the next issue of their magazines, and they were guarded, these individuals, by policemen who were unfortunately unarmed. The result is that's the softest target you can find. That's the easiest target. And remember, these were not suicide bombers. They wanted to get out of this alive. And that's how they did it.
Dr. Kia, I would venture to say that if we were sitting in the northern suburbs of France, there would not be a radio show like this taking place right now. And that's one of the principles I think is very important for the audience to understand, is the ability for us to have this conversation today right here in this manner is not something that is common throughout the throughout the planet. And to your point about the attack, I think it's important to understand that terrorism is something that has been going on since the beginning of time. It accomplishes a great deal of fear using the smallest amount of resources versus vast military type of action. France as a nation has been paying blood money for a number of decades, to the point that was made earlier, to stay away from our resources, stay away from our assets. They did this with the Palestinians, and they've done this consistently. And this has been a issue of division within the French society over the last 4 or 5 decades. I pay you off.
Yeah, and to the point that John made, and I think one of your callers had made, I think had left a comment with John, that this is not a question of just poverty or being orphan. There are a lot of rich Muslims who are involved, and that's absolutely correct. But we have to trace this back also partially to a very, very important event as far as the Muslims are concerned. And that is the war in Afghanistan in 1980s. That was the first real jihad or Islamic war. And it wasn't against the West. It was against Soviet Union. It was against the Red Army. It was against the atheistic, godless Russians, right? And guess who supported these efforts against the Soviets? Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and United States of America. And we actually both, we were boasting that we stood with Muslim freedom fighters.
The Mujahideen.
The Mujahideen.
Right.
And the translation for Mujahideen is not freedom fighter. It's those who fight in the name of the Quran. And we supported them, and bin Laden was there. So let us not also forget the fundamental fact that in the past, when it had served our interest, we actually stood with radical Islamists. And guess what? Our closest ally in the Middle East, at least one of them, which is the government of Saudi Arabia, it's still considered the most fundamentalist, the most Wahhabi Islamist government in the entire Islamic world. So those facts need to also be mentioned.
Yeah, we're gonna come right back. We're gonna continue this. We could go do this all day, but we have to take a break. We have all 3 lines open. If you'd like to jump into the conversation, you're not going to find this pretty much anywhere else. So that's why you listen to Talkback, and we'll be right back with more in a moment. Oh, the discussion just rolls right along here on Talkback. Welcome back, everybody. It's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. John King, Bob Seidenschwartz, Dr. Mehrdad Key. I'm Peter Christian. We have a Facebook comment. John, go ahead.
This is a comment from Steve. Steve says, ISIS was the wake-up? ? This is key. Only when radical Muslims attack other Muslims do they care. All others are infidels, the other, and can be treated differently, perhaps as non-persons. Common. Consider words like infidel, gaijin, heretic, fetus, and many more, be it Chinese to outsiders or soldiers, reducing enemies to slang terms to lessen the reality of killing them. I'm a former gaijin, having lived in Japan, so I can identify.
I'm a haole. I was born in Hawaii. I guess that's the same.
And I'm just won't even say it.
No, I mean the ISIS as a wake-up call was in the context of not for the first time as a wake-up call, but wake-up call to the regimes which had initially supported the idea of having a more radical Sunni movement fighting the Shia-dominated Iraq. And in this case, there is no doubt that the Saudis, Kuwaitis, and others in the Persian Gulf region had initially supported ISIS as a way of getting rid of Assad regime in Syria, as a way of reducing the power of the Iran-backed or the Iranian-backed Shia regime in Baghdad. And then they realized that they have supported not only thugs, but professional murderers. And under pressure from United States, but under pressure of the reality they were facing themselves, they began to modify their policy. Now, it is fascinating to note also that ISIS has adopted this motto, near enemy and far enemy. And right now, ISIS is far more obsessed and fixated with the near enemy being the Kurds, being the Iranians, being the Shia government in Baghdad, but also the monarchies of the Middle East who supposedly supported them in the beginning, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis. So I think these monarchies have woken up to the reality that the monster they had been supporting is now turning its weapons against them. The best sort of story, the best news in all this is that ISIS is so violent and it is so fundamentally fascistic in its approach to controlling societies, and it has introduced such a reign of terror that the very people who empathized with its ideas are not turning their backs to it.
Is it going to burn itself out?
Eventually, but it's not going to be an easy task. And I think it will involve a combination of military, but also political and cultural sort of struggle to get rid of it. And look, I mean, at one point, we have to be honest with ourselves. There are real issues on the ground in the Middle East, from poverty to unemployment to alienation to the worst kind of governments you can find. And a combination of all these factors come together and result into creation of radicalized individuals. And sheer military strikes against them would not be sufficient. In the long run, and we are talking about big ideas, change in the economic system, change in the educational system, creating a more open and democratic societies. Those are the real solutions to the problem of Islamic fundamentalism.
But we're talking a change that may take generations to effect.
Yeah, and I think we should stop sort of deluding ourselves to the fact that this has a solution tomorrow and this has a solution in 3 months. These issues that we are facing have their background from 1920s, right? Now we are getting the results of it. Muslim Brotherhood, the first Islamic fundamentalist movement in the Middle East, was founded in 1928. Right? And now we are getting the results of it over 60 years later. So I wouldn't be surprised, as Peter just mentioned, that we will be facing with this challenge for decades to come.
Along the lines of that, you were talking about it being fascistic, and most of the fascist dictators of the past have been very charismatic. I mean, think of Hitler, passionate speech maker. And when you think of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or some of the other leaders, I'm not culturally very disjunct from that, so it's hard for me to know if he is that kind of charismatic. But from what I pick up, it's not his charisma that's leading this movement, it's the ideology. And that's what I find more scary, and it's going to be much harder to burn that out.
And that ideology has deep roots, especially among the Arab countries. We are talking about, in principle, countries such as Syria, Iraq, Egypt, so on and so forth. And again, the ideology which has created Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi goes back to really the so-called anti-British movement back in 1920s Egypt. And now the results we see in Iraq and Syria. So there is a long process. And the way al-Baghdadi sells it, and John is completely correct, he doesn't strike you as a very charismatic individual, but the way he sells it is that this is a real anti-colonial, anti-Western sort of movement.
We're going to come right back, 721-1290. We have all three lines open. Only another half an hour on the show, folks, and it is going to fly by. So we'll be right back. This is Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. It's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Dr. Mehrdad Key is sharing his very valuable time with us this morning, along with Bob Seidenschwartz. And we have folks on the phone. Craig, you are on Talkback. Good morning, sir.
Craig, you're on Talkback. Oh, I am.
Hi, fellas. Who's with you there, Craig?
Well, you know, that Muslim religion, it's just as violent as the KKK. You could name numerous other groups, but, you know, call it what it is. If those, I'd sure hate for one of them damn churches to move into our neighborhood. You know, and we don't tolerate the KKK. We don't tolerate Nazis or anything. So
actually, America does tolerate. We do tolerate the KKK. We do tolerate Nazis in the United States. They're here. They tell people who they are. There's people like David Duke that go on television, and they are allowed to speak freely in this country, which many people have a big problem.
I guess we do tolerate the damn things, but we sure do sneer at them, don't we?
Well, see, and again, as I mentioned before the doctor got here, there's a difference between tolerance and acceptance.
Yes, there is indeed. You know, you guys call us out on our little quirks often enough.
Yeah. All right, thanks for the call, Craig. All right, let's get Bobby on the line. Bobby, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, here's my question. When Hitler came into power, he got together with the Grand Mufti and Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood was considered to be the Arab Nazis. Then after World War II, and Russia, Britain, and the U.S. divided up the spoils of war, at some point the Muslim Brotherhood came under control of the U.S. Then in 1950s, when Egypt banned the Muslim Brotherhood, the United States relocated them to Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Bob, go ahead.
As a person with some knowledge of this, I have never heard in any way, shape, or form that this was a act of cooperation between the United States and a relocation of the Brotherhood. I would say for the most part, the Brotherhood was probably off the radar of most of the statesmen and various organizations within the United States until the last 20 to 30 years in any serious type of way.
All right.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Bobby. Thanks for the call.
Okay. You know, Peter, can I say something? As we're having this conversation, it's very important that we're talking about France and Islam and immigration. This is an issue that's right here in our own backyard. And I think it's very insightful for us to have this discussion, but let's relate this back to lessons learned about how we assimilate and how we deal with people of different viewpoints and religions and such, because this is not going away in the United States for decades to come as we deal with our own immigration issues.
Well, see, here and again, being a surface observer of history, I don't delve into it as deeply as Professor Kia. But when this country was, when we opened the borders and the Statue of Liberty and bring us your poor and your, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, people moved into our country. They spread out. They found opportunity. And when they went to various cities and towns, they formed the people, birds of a feather. They flocked together. They spoke the same language, had the same cultures. And yet, at the underpinning of that was the concept of this is a country where we are allowed to be free to be who we are, And not only that, but that freedom gives us a construct to be able to work our business, work our farms, build our craft, do whatever we do. And so you have a rich neighborhood, rich with tradition, that is still accepted by all the other neighborhoods, all the other neighbors. I realize this is, fantastically idealistic. I'm sure there were wars between the various ones. But in all, America was this wonderful melting pot where people had the same freedoms, taught by the Constitution, that you have the freedom to be who you are and to do what you can do with the talents that God gave you. And I don't think there's ever been a country like that in the world. And so when other countries have a massive immigration, they don't have the same structure of freedom. Now, am I wrong about that or not?
First of all, part of that mass migration to United States from Europe, Middle East, Asia included tens of thousands of Muslims. I don't think we recognize that some of the oldest immigrant communities in this country were Muslims. And they did not settle in New York or Los Angeles. They settled in New Jersey. They settled in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where we still have a huge mosque in the eastern side of the state. And you're completely correct. It was based on this concept of freedom. And I think what is fundamentally different, and I think Michel in his call mentioned this, the communitarian model versus the integration model, is that we always accepted the theory, or at least the theoretical model of hyphenated identities, right? That is, German Americans, we are French Americans, we are Irish Americans, and now we have Arab Americans and Iranian Americans and so on and so forth. And this is fundamentally different from a German model, right? Where you're either German and part of the German society and you abide by the German constitution and German rules and laws, or you're not. And this hyphenated identity is one way of integration which has been very successful in the case of United States. And I pray and I hope that we do not abandon this, because this is a model which has worked. And through this model, a large majority, and I say this and God forbid something bad happens, but the overwhelming majority of Muslims, regardless of where they have come from to this country, they have thrived in this country. They have received very good education. They have become part of the middle class, and they have become part of the society. And from the very beginning of this program, I said that I think we should be very careful about not generalizing about people and not putting all Muslims in one corner and say, you're all terrorists, you're all fanatics, because they are not. And they are, many of them, moderate, middle class, educated Muslims who have thrived in this country. They are our best allies in the struggle against radical Islam.
Okay. All right. When we get back from this break, I'd like you to tell the West what we should do to deal with Islam going forward. What should France do after this event?
We're going to come right... Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll be right back. Stay with us. The stuff you miss when we're on break, I got to tell you. We just had an interesting definition of a real American, Bob. I'm just kidding.
We can't... Yeah, that's why it's off the air.
Okay, no, Dr. Kia, John just asked you a question. And so your advice to Muslims and to us... How do we make this work? How do we here in River City in good old Missoula, Montana, because we'd like to bring this home to our hometown and to our listeners, how do we help to assimilate all these ideas we've heard into our everyday life and the way we look at life and look at the world?
I think what has happened in France, and I realize this is a shocking, horrifying event, and the French nation is in shock of dealing with such a murderous and cowardly act. At the same time, I think this is a great opportunity for the French to come together as a nation, which they have come together, and especially for that 10% of the population, the Muslim population, to make a stand against any form of violence, any form of attack on civilian population on any ground with any justification. And I think for us to recognize that this is the new form of threat and terrorism we will be facing. It's not going to come from a headquarter, from a cave in Afghanistan. It's going to come in the shape of what happened in Boston, what just happened in Paris. It's going to be, quote unquote, I don't like this description, but the lone wolf, or two brothers coming together and training themselves online or by going to Syria, by going to Chechnya, understanding how you make bombs and how you terrorize innocent people. We have to be prepared for this. It's going to come to us in one way or another. And despite all our best efforts, this is going to be a tough challenge to face. But the last thing we should do is divide ourselves as a country, as a nation, among Christians versus Muslims, Muslims versus Jews. We are all Americans. And we all love this country, and we have to stand together and fight against terrorism in all its manifestations. And terrorism, it's a form of intolerance. And we have to stand against that form of intolerance, which is against the very foundation of our civilization.
You, along with many other people, are saying we need to stand against this. We need to stand against this. And in fact, I think the president said we were standing with France. What the heck does that mean? What is it? What character of standing, quote unquote, do we show?
First and foremost, I think we have to cooperate on the governmental level with the issue of sharing intelligence and information with our allies. And that's the most rational way of dealing with this threat. Because yesterday it was in France, tomorrow it might spill over into Germany. And the day after, it might come to the United States in a new form and in a new shape. So cooperation with allies is one of the most basic steps to deal with this. But also to learn from the mistakes that have been made in this case, and to also understand the nature of the threat that is coming to us, which is quite new now.
May I add something too that is, I think, from my perspective, critically important? The United States has always been viewed by the world as a beacon of economic opportunity. Lest we forget, the Middle East is overwhelmingly young in terms of its demographics. And this is an issue that is universal, but particularly in regions where you have so much of your population under 30 years old. The best thing, along with what Dr. Kia just said, is the United States shows itself to continue to be a place where people want to come for economic opportunity. Innovation, intuition, opportunity. Education. Right. If you really want to affect the change that needs to be done over generations, don't fall backwards in terms of what got you to this point.
Okay, let's get Michael on the line. Michael, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Good morning, Peter and John. How are you guys doing?
Excellent, sir.
Hey, it seems like you guys are talking about World War II a little bit here, and can you explain to me and the audience the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 in relationship to the UN and that?
We're not really talking about World War II at all. I guess we talked about Hitler as an example of a fascist, and we talked about the Grand Mufti a little bit.
When you mentioned that agreement, all four of us went, huh?
So I've heard of the Bretton Woods Agreement, but I don't see the relevance to Islamofascism.
It's an economic agreement.
Yeah.
It has a lot to do with the United Nations and how they're treating the viewpoint of how nations form together on certain issues, certain topics, and I think that has a direct relationship to what's going on in the world today.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's ask Dr. Kia. Do you think that the United Nations has any role in this, or is this something that, if you will, this quote superpower, the United States or other formidable military powers have a chance to stand up, or is the United Nations going to have to play a part in this, or could they?
I can only share very superficial observation about United Nations, United Nations as a highly bureaucratic and highly dysfunctional organization.
A strongly worded letter is coming your way.
And
hard to be a
very much dependent on the contributions of the main powers, its own members.
Sure. All right.
Real quick, I got to go answer this phone call. But a second ago, you said we need to learn from our mistakes. What were the mistakes? Because a lot of people are saying that it was a mistake for them to allow him to draw a picture of the Prophet Muhammad for that cartoon. A lot of people are saying it was a mistake for people to have free speech. I mean, there's a lot of people saying different things are wrong, and these led to the events that happened, the atrocity yesterday. So I want to hear what you think are the mistakes.
Okay, stand by. 1 minute. 1 minute from now. I'm sorry. So Dave, and we'll try to get as many calls. We're running really short of time, so we'll be right back. Okay, real quickly, John asked a question, Dr. Kia. What are the mistakes?
Yeah, I'm not referring to the publication of these cartoons as a mistake. The magazine had the absolute right to publish, to print these cartoons, and this was a convenient justification for these criminals, for these terrorists to use to murder these innocent human beings. I am an avid, maybe some would call me a dogmatic defender of free speech. I believe that free speech is something that we should defend and fight against any threat. Now, this is a clear violation of the most basic principle that a cartoonist cannot publish because it causes incitement. What is next now? Sensitivities are always hurt. Sensitivities are always insulted. Next, we're going to have another group of people saying, oh, this cartoon now bothers me, you cannot publish it. Once you start this process of using one thing to censor ourselves, to self-censor, then it's an open road for the
A gentleman in
red.
Canada was sentenced to a year in prison just recently for acts of condemnation of the Quran on a train, of course, in a public place. Now, I don't know the degree of the details. He may have been doing something more than just condemning the Quran, but that's one of the questions that you're raising is then what can we not say without fear of type of reprisal?
That was in Canada.
Yes.
Let's get Dave on real quickly. Dave, you're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Yes, in my mind, the defeat of the army of ISIL will be easy. Will be really easy compared to trying to get rid of the idea of ISIL, and that's going to take time and a lot of effort. And I don't think you can do it with intolerance because intolerance can't fight intolerance. So we're going to have to somehow convince people that our way is better.
All right, Dave, thanks. So do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I really think that defeating ISIS militarily is something achievable within a very short time. Defeating the idea that has given rise to ISIS would take decades. And here I definitely agree with my friend and colleague Bob that the last thing we should do is wall ourselves and put a fence around the country and say, no, we're not going to take you, because what makes this country great and what makes it the model in the world is that it's beacon for economic prosperity, for the best education, and these are the instruments that we have to use to convince the rest of the world that this interaction should continue.
It's what everybody wants. Right. Anyway, so let's get Greg on the line. Greg, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask the doctor about the doctrine, if I understand. Now, there's a doctrine, the Muslim doctrine, opposite of the Christian doctrine, and how that's different from what the Islamics are believing and what he claims his Muslim thinking.
A doctrine of what?
The doctrine of the Quran.
Teaching what, though?
Teaching as I understand it, Muhammad teaching his thinking on to be a Muslim, the murder.
Okay, all right.
That.
Okay, so Well, doctor, what do you think?
Just very quickly, going back, you literally have to go back and you look at if we take this correctly, because it was not written at that time, I don't believe, the word of Muhammad was then taken, and over the decades and centuries, different views and interpretations of that were codified. So there probably are basics that are truisms, but you could literally have 70 different imams taking something that Muhammad had said and saying, well, this is what he meant, and this is what it's supposed to be, such as, on a number of different viewpoints.
And different Muslim traditions disagree. Just think, to compare and contrast, Christian traditions of baptism. Some have full body immersion here in the United States. I go to a tradition where infants are baptized. Others disagree. Communion, at some places there's wine and bread. At other places there's grape juice and a little wafer that looks like cardboard. There's all kinds of different traditions that have developed out of this, and the doctrines are different.
But we don't go to war over them. At least I hope not. At least not anymore, anyway.
And I think it's important, just very briefly, because we're running out of time.
We have 2.5 minutes, so please go ahead.
Absolutely. That from the very beginning, in the Islamic world, there has been either a problem, and some people have suggested that this was actually the greatness of Islam in beginning, that there has not been one interpretation of Islam. There are actually 5 different schools of jurisprudence in Islam, which have their own interpretations, which are at times very different from one another. And because of that, from the very beginning, the Islamic world has been split into many different schools and many different interpretations. On top of that, you have different sects in Islam. For example, the Shia, or Shiites, who are about 150 million. They have a very different tradition from the mainline Sunnis or Orthodox Muslims. The majority of Iranians are Shia, the majority of Lebanese, the majority of Iraqis are Shia, and so on and so forth. So the issue of Islam, and this is, I'm not trying to not answer, but the doctrine of Islam, the second question is, then which doctrine of Islam, according to which school of jurisprudence, and in which country, and according to which authority and which imam or which source of law?
All right.
And you find this in Christianity with the various degrees.
All right. Now, Doctor, if folks want to get more information about what you're talking about, can you suggest any, is there a website or something we can go to hear more about how you have to say about it?
Here is what we have done. We have been teaching 2 courses on Islamic civilization at the University of Montana. This is not talking about Islam per se as a religion, but the history of Islam, right from the beginning. The first part, the classical period, which we teach during the autumn semester, takes us all the way to 18th century. The one that we are teaching in spring takes us from 18th century to the present moment. So we are offering these courses. At the same time, we will be holding several brown bags, and in April, I hope that Bob and I will be back to talk about our upcoming conference, part of which will deal with the issue of Islam and terrorism in the Middle East.
We're completely out of time. Thank you so much for your time. Very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Bob, and thanks for all of our callers. And tomorrow we'll have Austin Knudsen on. Is that right?
That's right. Speaker of the House for the Montana Legislature will be on for 30 minutes or so.
Okay, and you folks have yourself a great day. Enjoy this glorious sunshine. Stay warm, and we'll see you tomorrow.